Hello, everyone, and welcome to this presentation on white-tailed deer biology and habitat. I'm Norm Haley. I'm a natural resources management agent here in the northeastern corner of Alabama. There's 8 counties that I serve in this part of the state. I'm housed in the Jackson County office here in Scottsboro, and we border both Franklin and Marion County, Tennessee. So glad that we can provide you all this presentation today. As we move through, got to begin with some housekeeping here. We are a equal opportunity educator and employer here at Extension, and here you can see our USDA statement on our equal opportunity. There it is in English and as well in Spanish. You can also view this same statement on the USDA website as well. So moving on with today's presentation, first I'd like to give some background on the biology and ecology of white-tailed deer. And they're distributed widely throughout the United States and also several different subspecies as well, 38 in total. We're dominated by the southern white-tailed deer throughout Alabama and in portions of Tennessee as well. But we have seen some reintroductions that have taken place when deer densities were very low. As they tried to rebuild those populations, different subspecies were brought in beyond the southern white-tailed deer, which is also what goes into explaining some of the different timings of the deer rut, and we'll talk more about that as we go. As far as the overall description is concerned, of course, they've got their name from that white underside of the tail that you've seen as they've run away from you and flagged to alert others. Usually they'll throw that up when they're startled. Here in Alabama and throughout a lot of Tennessee as well, those ranges in doe weights come anywhere between 90 and 140 pounds per animal, and bucks are a bit larger in that 140 to even 250 pound size range. Right now, as we sit with this presentation in August, we have the deer population exhibiting that rusty orangish color that we're seeing right now in the field. That's a short, thin coat that usually comes in around April or May, and that'll give way to their wintertime coat where they grow a much longer, hollow hair that helps to keep them warm warm in the cooler months of the season. And we'll see that coming in here later in the month on through September. They'll begin to transition to that brownish gray coloration. As far as some of their predator defenses are concerned, they've got a lot of them. Of course, if you spent much time hunting or trying to view deer in the wild, you can tell that they've got a good nose on them. They can smell from a long ways away and have a really good sense of smell as well. Their hearing is exceptional, large ears that they can hear and twist and turn to be able to pick up sound in multiple directions. And they run fast, up to about 40 miles an hour. With that summer coat and winter coat that we just described, especially the winter coat as the fall wears on, that really does well to camouflage them in a lot of the habitat that they reside in. Fairly good vision. They can see movement, but that vision at nighttime is really good, 9 times greater than what we can see as they can pick up light in those low light conditions, and they are able to see in about 180-degree range of vision there. They do not see color the way we see, which is a good thing for those regulations in Alabama and Tennessee where we're required to wear hunter orange. Deer cannot pick up colors anywhere near like what we can, so that hunter orange is relatively low visibility for them. Diet's really important, especially when it comes to the later part of this presentation where we start to talk about some of their habitat requirements. Deer are browsers, and they require a lot of browse, about 4 to 6 pounds of forage per every 100 pound of body weight that they have, which basically equates to bushel baskets of vegetation that they have to take in on a daily basis. And when it comes to that forage, it comes in a lot of varieties. Forbs, otherwise what a lot of folks will call as weeds, really aren't what we call weeds as a deer manager or the deer themselves. That's food. Lots of different leaves, things like twigs and woody browse, the buds from some of that fresh woody vegetation. Lots of fruits and soft mast, hard mast, acorns, of course, is what we usually think of when it comes to that fall deer food preference. But lots of vines and annual grasses and shrubs and things that we plant for them as well in terms of some of those food plot plantings. They leave a lot of sign a lot of sign behind, especially if you're trying to, pattern a deer or tell, where they're present and some good areas to hunt after. Of course, bucks will rub trees very often to get the velvet off as their antlers begin to harden up later in the fall, and then also just to mark territory and spread scent and communicate. Of course, they leave lots of tracks around. That's a great way to tell trails and signs that are a sign of an area that they're really traveling back and forth quite a bit. They'll also put down scrapes where they'll communicate during the reproductive period, but there are also scrapes that do remain active all year long. Of course, where they browse and do all that foraging, you will see examples of nipped off plants and things like that. Some things that they select more than others will be browsed more than others. And of course, they leave behind plenty of droppings as they go through the woods as well. Lots of times, you'll just reference those as kind of the size of a milk dud, if you will. Pretty good way to tell if deer are really keying in on an area for a long period of time. You'll see more droppings than others. As far as their communications, we've mentioned the rubs and scrapes already, and a lot of that is from communication and gland secretions. They have a sense of smell, like we mentioned. They can pick up and communicate and find potential mates and deer travel areas for reproduction. Vocalizations, they make lots of different sounds. Grunts are one we think of a lot as far as bleats and mews and things like that. Whines and sneezes, they'll all produce those at some point throughout their life, especially bucks when it comes to reproduction and territorial time frames. And speaking of reproduction, I hinted earlier that we've got multiple subspecies that have been stocked throughout the South. So that rut timing can really vary. And this map here is throughout Alabama, and you'll also see varied rut times. Of course, the deer don't pay a whole lot of attention to state lines. So as that deferred late winter time period you see there in our part of the state here in Jackson County, that will leak over into Franklin and Marion County as well. Whereas a lot of the rest of the state of Tennessee will see a rut timing more in that mid November time frame. But here in Alabama, they'll rut anywhere from October all the way through February. Really prolonged rut period throughout the state because of that restocking effort. And very often our yearling bucks and 1.5-year-old does are capable to reproduce. A lot of that can be habitat oriented. The better habitat they have, the earlier on and more successful those younger deer will be at reproducing. As far as fawning is concerned, in Alabama, again, that varied rut timing is going to vary when those fawns are hitting the ground. So we see fawns anywhere from April all the way through November even. But we kind of average throughout the state with a fawn drop hanging around July to that mid-August time frame. And it's basically 200 days from conception. So based on whenever your rut timing is, 200 days following that is when you'll see your fawns being birthed. As far as birth rates concerned, yearling does will very often produce just a single fawn in good habitat conditions. They will reproduce. A 2.5-year-old will generally be able to support twins, and it is possible sometimes to see 3 and even 4 fawns, but that's fairly rare. And again, that birthing rate is going to be habitat dependent. The better the habitat is, the better fawn drop you're going to see in your area. As far as fawn ecology is concerned, they've got some defenses. Their main defense, honestly, is just staying still. They're birthed fairly scent free, so they rely on staying still and that spotted camouflage. You can see there looking through that thick area dominated in poison ivy. As that light is trickling through, it very much emulates that spotted coloration on that fawn coat. Once they're about 3 to 4 months of age, they generally will lose those spots and begin a more standard white-tailed deer coloration. They'll get up and follow mom at about 3 to 4 weeks of age. And just kind of a side note as far as management, it's a really big reason that we try to avoid haying around that 4-week period of peak fawning, to where those fawns can get up and move and don't get mowed or hayed over. And that doe's nutrition does directly impact that fawn growth. So again, hinting towards the latter part of the presentation, habitat's super important. The better we can provide mom with nutrition, the better she's going to be able to raise and the faster that fawn's going to grow. And that leads into another aspect of fawn ecology, which is fawning cover. And adults will use fawning cover as well. But essentially, fawning covers forbs and grasses that are like in that 4 to 6 foot tall range. And a lot of times we see those in areas with about 3 to 6 years of regrowth. And we'll talk a lot more about some of that cover and habitat component as we move on. And this is a good example of a visual of that. You can see that the truck parked there, lots of early successional, and we'll talk more about early successional habitat as well, but lots of early successional species there, really good cover to hide a fawn, really good cover to produce that shade during the warm months. The fawn can stay covered and secluded in there, and also cool and comfortable until mom comes back to nurse. As far as deer lifespan is concerned, it really does depend really on how much the area is hunted. In heavily hunted populations, we don't see a whole lot of deer making it past that 4 year range, but they can live a long time, 8 to even 10 years, where hunting pressure is light or where the hunting pressure is really highly selective as well. As far as determining age on a deer, we can use body characteristics to age deer on the hoof. A live whitetail age can be roughly estimated by different body characteristics. You see the illustration at the top of this slide. A lot of times we're looking at the neck junction kind of down towards the brisket. The more smooth transition and filled out that is, the older the deer is going to be. The more the belly sags, the more the back sags are all indications of an older deer. You've got to take into account habitat conditions, though. You know, our deer aren't quite as big as Iowa deer are concerned, so body size does have to be relative to the area you're hunting in. And it's important to point out that antler points and overall size of those antlers do not correspond to age. There are some very special genetics out there where deer grow very large antlers even at a young age. So still, those body characteristics are the best to go off of for a live age estimation. Once that deer is in hand and been harvested, we can age relatively accurately to about 3.5 years of age, looking at tooth wear and replacement, looking at how much dentine or that black area is on that deer's molar. We can age based on that wear, and younger deer as well. For example, fawns will lack that final molar. It's a really good way to look at that tooth wear and replacement and be able to estimate deer. Beyond 3.5 years of age, deer wear and replacement becomes fairly subjective, even among professionals. So there are lab services now where you can send off an incisor to have that aged on a cementum analysis through a deer lab. Antlers are certainly a hot topic when it comes towards deer management. And in this case, the ecology presentation, but bucks do develop and shed antlers each year. They're not a horn which stays with an animal the entire life. They're an antler which does get shed. They're usually beginning to grow around March to June, and they'll shed those most often sometime between January and April. And again, it depends on that rut timing and that subspecies. Growing antlers like they are right now are covered in velvet. That's a soft hair membrane with a lot of blood vessels that are bringing nutrients and minerals to deposit that really fast growing bone. Usually they're hardened off and they'll shed that velvet in that August to September timeframe. And this is just an illustration of just how fast those antlers are developed. You see this deer from April all the way through September, just the amount of growth that takes place in a very short amount of time. And it's also important to consider that, you know, if you're interested in a buck's growth potential and pursuing, you know, large antlered deer, you really have to think about what habitat you've got available and what you're providing that buck in this time frame of that April to September time frame. In Alabama, really from March through September most often, because that's when antlers are being developed. The better vegetation and habitat you have, the more mineral and nutrient requirements are going to be met by that deer, and they'll be able to express their antler growth potential to the fullest. Age, nutrition, which is really habitat based, your overall herd management and genetics are all really what go into impacting antler development. A deer is going to meet its body requirements first. And then whatever excess nutrition it has available will be devoted to antler growth. So, of course, the more nutrition you have available, the better off your antler production is going to be. Very often we're talking about a minimum 16% protein driving that body condition. And the more we can meet that requirement, the more improved antler growth we're going to have. And if we're managing habitat correctly, Mother Nature is going to provide this. Those antlers consist primarily of calcium and phosphorus. And again, if we're managing habitat, it will be in that forage and that browse. Those bucks will find that nutrition. In poor soils or where your habitat is lacking, we do see a recipe of a kind of a homemade mineral lick of that 2 parts dicalcium phosphate to 1 part salt. That is something that you can do to supplement your bucks during their antler growth. In areas where you've got good habitat, you'll see very little use of mineral sites, or sometimes even no use at all because they're already meeting those nutrition requirements through the habitat and then the browse that they're consuming. So if you balance herd and habitat and high quality food resources, you're going to improve and maximize your antler development in your herd as well. So overall, just to put a illustration with what I just described, what's really influencing antler development the most, it'll be age. Young deer don't express their antler growth nearly as much as older deer do, followed by nutrition, and then next up would be genetics. And just to emphasize this, 78% of yearlings are producing spikes. So that's a really good, you know, way to prove just how much age drives antler production. If a year and a half old deer, 78% of those are producing spikes. Of course, you have to let them age to express their full antler growth. We don't see, 130-inch year and a half old deer in the wild. So further on down the line, looking at 2.5, 3.5, and 4.5-year-old deer, you can see that once a deer has reached 4.5 years old, essentially they've maximized their antler growth to the 92% potential, overall potential. And for the most part, 90-some% of our deer produce their largest set of antlers at 4.5 years old. So a lot of times when you're talking about really managing for, quality or trophy bucks, you're trying to maximize the number of 4.5-year-olds you have on the landscape. And then at that point is when you're looking to take that deer once they've reached their 90% plus antler potential. And again, here's just another visual of, that 1.5-year-old spike and then what they were able to produce moving on through 2.5, 3.5, 4.5, and to that 5.5-year-old age. And you can see the production from that 3.5 to 4.5 to 5.5 certainly does increase from that 3.5-year-old age, but the difference between him at 4.5 and 5.5 just really isn't a whole lot. So you can really see a good illustration there of that potential that was exhibited at 4.5 and just a little bit more growth at 5.5. Those deer with exceptional genetics do continue on, but again, those are exceptional genetics and fairly rare in the population. So a lot of folks are managing and very happy to take a 4.5-year-old deer once they've expressed that antler potential. And another big take home that's going to really transition into the next part of habitat here is the concept of epigenetics, or that's just modified gene expression. And this is a really important concept and really kind of drives home the importance of habitat, is that when a doe is nutritionally stressed, they're going to produce fawns with genetics that also express a smaller body and antler size. And that's just to cope with poor conditions and poor habitat quality and nutrition. If you improve habitats, or if you improve the habitat over the course of several years, in this case, in year 3, that doe will essentially know that habitat conditions are improving. And in that year 3, they're going to produce fawns that have now the genetics for an improved body size and antler development. So I also drive this home too, to where if you just, come onto a property or you're looking to improve an existing property, it really does take about 3 years into habitat improvements to really see those genetics expressed in the population. So this just goes to show how important genetics are, or how important habitat is, because it can even alter and provide genetics on the landscape different from good quality versus poor quality habitat conditions. So habitat really, it really is key. So when I say habitat, what does that really mean? Well, habitat is an area that's going to provide everything that animal needs. And what are those needs? It's food, water, cover, and space. So the basic needs for deer, of course, are food, like we've already discussed, the forbs, the grasses, soft mass, woody browse, and crops and food plot plantings as well. Water, we don't see as a limiting factor here in the Southeast. We have a lot of water that can be very different for some more dry and arid areas, but in the Southeast here, Alabama and Tennessee, water's not going to be limiting. Even in drought years, deer can find water. Cover, that can be limiting. It's super necessary for the protection from weather and also predation. Lots of cover also provides food as well. I'll explain that later. And space. Usually in average quality habitat here in the Southeast, we see deer ranging between 600 to 1,200 acres. That's important to consider too, that if you're not the owner of a 600 to 1,200 acre block, your deer are ranging onto the neighbors as well, right? So what the neighbors are doing as far as their habitat and their harvest practices are also going to dictate your deer herd and your hunting quality as well. So moving on to some more specifics of habitat, deer are highly adaptable. They can exist in multiple different environments, but existing and just surviving is very different from thriving, right? So we can see deer in urban landscapes struggling along and again not really reaching their full genetic potential, not being in the best condition, but they're gonna still exist, and you'll see deer populations and deer herds in a wide variety of habitat condition. But they're best suited for diverse habitats, and we're going to talk a lot about this. But areas that have open fields to cut over to mature hardwoods and everything in between are really going to be where they're going to excel at. They're a very edge-oriented species. The more diverse vegetation they have, the better off they're going to be. So, what's most often limiting when it comes towards a deer habitat component? Well, it's these two factors. It's nutrition. If you have unbalanced herd and habitat, they're going to suffer and again not have their maximum body weights, maximum antler potential, maximum reproduction and recruitment. It's going to be stressed, and a lot of times we see that stress this time of year in late summer and also in early fall. Our native vegetation in a lot of places is declining. And not managed correctly to where we see nutritional deficits. They also are limited in fawning recruitment, and a lot of times that goes back to the nutrition, but also cover as well. They need protection from predators during their first few months of life. Like I mentioned before, they can get up and run with mom. They're very susceptible to predation in that first 3 to 4 weeks of life. And also healthy does, again, I referenced this earlier, but the better that they are able to produce milk and quality milk for their fawns, the better off they're going to be. So we see that necessary through quality browse and nutrition as well. So what are the habitats that best foster nutrition in this fawning cover? It's primarily going to be dominated with a term you hear a lot in deer and lots of other wildlife management, turkey and things like that as well. But it's early successional vegetation, and that's basically just an herbaceous dominated plant community. Lots of forbs and broadleaf plants, pioneer woody species, and these are areas that are going to provide the cover and the nutrition, and they're maintained and or they're produced through timber harvest, prescribed fire, herbicide, disking, and also weather events, where we have strong winds and tornadoes, for example, come through and blow over, closed canopy timber that can foster on some of this early plant community type growth. What's not early succession? Essentially, areas that are dominated by woody species, producing a lot of shade and limited cover and browse for deer in this case. A lot of times that's going to come onto the landscape of vegetation that's older than that 7 to 9 year range. But that can very much depend on your plants in that area, those species, and also soil productivity, weather for that 7 to 9 years. And we call that arrested succession. Essentially, once you get woody species up and dominating the landscape, producing a canopy, shading out the lower forest growth, the ground growth. That's arrested succession, and habitat quality really declines, and deer use and wildlife use very much declines in areas like that. So to put a visual of that, in these early, first to 9 years of vegetation growth, that's really what we're talking about as far as an early successional stage. And very often beyond that, again, that 7 to 9 year range depends on productivity, is when we really begin to see that young forest develop, that shade develops, food quality and cover really declines. So what does early succession provide for deer? Really, for both fawns and adults, it's providing escape cover from predation, bedding areas, that fawning cover we've already harped on, that green browse, woody browse, soft mast, and I've got an asterisk here by thermal cover. So what does it lack? Hard mast, acorn production, and also thermal cover. So thermal cover is sort of a it depends kind of a deal. In the warm growing season, the area, this is a repeat of that picture earlier I showed you for fawning cover, that's producing a lot of shade. That is thermal cover during the warm season. And then, of course, during the cooler season, all that shade necessarily wouldn't be so advantageous. They'd want to be in the sun, for example. So early succession is it depends. Sometimes it can provide the thermal cover you need, and sometimes it doesn't. So this is a key concept. Ideal habitat is going to contain multiple successional stages. The early succession, like I've already harped on, provides lots of benefits for white-tailed deer and other species as well. But that doesn't mean we don't have room and we don't need to manage towards mature forest as well. Of course, there's still value there as well. But rather than managing in a large expanse of one vegetation type, for example, closed canopy forest, we want to try to intersperse 1 to 2 year old early successional areas, some 3 to 5 year old early successional areas, and maybe some of that thicker holding cover up to that 9 year part of a management. So that regrowth and that kind of patchwork throughout the landscape is really what we're trying to manage for again, not just deer, but lots of wildlife. And again, that's managed in part through timber harvest, and it's maintained through fire and disking, herbicide, invasive plant control, things like that. We're maintaining it with disturbance. We have to get in there and actively manage, because if we don't, what's going to result is a young forest that grows into a mature forest. We want to maintain those early stages of succession. So let's put some visuals with this as well. On the left here, we've got a good example of a field standing in next to a kind of a shrubby, what we would not really refer to as a feathered or a soft edge that then goes back in the background there and meets a more mature forest. That's a really good example of having some early succession along a field edge. And the contrary here is to the right, where you have a very low growing field next to a really kind of what we would refer to as a hard edge, where it abruptly meets more mature timber. We'd much more recommend managing towards that softer feathered edge like you see there on the left. Here's a great example of early succession, and what we very often see following a cutover, whether it's a cutover of pine or hardwood, really makes no difference. When we completely remove that canopy of overstory trees, what you're left with is a lot of early pioneer species, forbs and grasses that provide a lot of really nice cover for fawns, turkey poults, and nesting. And then also that browse and forage that so many deer find lacking on the landscape. This is a really good example of an old field in early succession. We've a mowed lane here with some early pioneering species in this field, and you see it's backing up towards a more mature hardwood canopy in the back. Lots of value here as far as browse and cover is concerned for deer of all ages. Here's another example on a property that's managed for wildlife. We have a diversity of cover here from hardwoods, closed canopy hardwoods here on the left, field here that's planted and maintained in food plot type plantings, a more later stage of old field management here in the middle, where we've got some waist high cover, and then some pines growing in the back here. So here's a good example of edge kind of all coming together between food plots, hardwoods, and pines, and a grassy and forb covered early successional field there. Here's what we say a lot of when we make landowner visits and provide recommendations is closed canopy hardwoods and closed canopy pine. And you can see there that there's just not a lot of value in either one of these situations, where the shade is dominating and we have very little understory growth. There's just not a lot of food nor cover provided. Now, yes, in that hardwood canopy, there could potentially be some years where there's really good acorn production, but for the majority of the life of that stand, you just don't see a whole lot of value towards wildlife. And the The opposite would be true here, where we have a pine stand that's not in that mid-story rotation like we just saw, but it's seen a few thinnings. It's seen some active burns run through it, and you can see the understory here is just far and away different from the pine needles we were just looking at. Lots of good cover and browse produced in a pine stand that's seen some thinning, and then also some fire and herbicide as well. Here's a picture of a bottomland hardwood stand, also very much what we would see along stream corridors, SMZs, where hardwoods are maintained for water quality. These areas are very often maintained in closed canopy forest because of, again, water quality and erosion concerns. And this is an area where we perfectly accept hardwood coverage and closed canopy, and there's still value in these stands. Like I mentioned, for acorn production, we just don't want to see an area like this dominate the landscape. Power lines are an extremely good example of edge and early succession. They're often maintained through the power company, and with that maintenance comes mowing, comes herbicide applications that keeps a lot of, for example, in this picture, you can see the sumac coverage where you've got some shade and some cover, lots of herbaceous species, lots of opportunity to see deer cross and use these areas because otherwise, and you can see in this picture, lots of closed canopy surrounding the power line. Power lines are often a place where hunting is focused because the deer are there and the animals are there because of the cover and the food that isn't being produced and available in those closed canopies. And I put this on here too, more as a reminder to myself, but also to talk about and to think about as a landowner is what's going on around you. You know, mature corn is a place where deer do a lot of loafing and a lot of spending the time. They've got a lot of shade in here, easy to navigate and move around. And of course, the food resource that's produced here as well. But we have to consider what happens to our deer cover and our deer herd in general once essentially the covers are pulled off of them and those egg crops, whether it's corn or otherwise, are harvested. That can really dictate some of the habitat management that we might be doing on our own property that we have access to. So essentially, this picture is just meant to reiterate the fact that we want to maintain, again, that patchwork. The more habitat types that you can maintain on your landscape, the better off you're going to be in terms of year-round holding and attraction for deer, production, browse, cover. The more of a patchwork mindset you can manage towards in your mind, the better off you're going to be in terms of wildlife value on that property. And very often we're having to meet this goal through some sort of a timber harvest. And then we're very often maintaining it through herbicide, prescribed fire, and also some timely disking as well. So that's the disturbance that we're using to maintain this patchwork and not let it advance into those later successional stages of closed canopy and arrested succession, like I referenced earlier. So just to harp a little bit on deer and prescribed fire, there are some impacts, both positive and negative, of prescribed fire, but essentially they're all going to be for the greater good. One of the negatives is that if you've freshly burned an area, you'll see that does with fawns do avoid that. They just don't have cover at that time, right? However, if we do fresh growing season burns, that provides a lot of nutritious plant growth, which is really 70% of a deer's diet. If we thin a stand, that's going to increase and provide light to the ground. Again, some sort of disturbance, spur on some early successional vegetation. That's going to increase deer use anywhere between 1.5 to 2.5 times on that site. Variability in fire intervals is what's going to maintain your dense cover. So yes, even though does with fawns avoid freshly burned areas, when you're rotationally burning and managing in a patchwork, they don't have to go very far to find that cover. And then once that stand that was freshly burned recovers and begins to produce that nutritious growth, they'll be back in that stand and using it. It's important to understand that when we're managing with fire or looking at the landscape and habitat management as a whole, that we really don't want to go too far towards a grassy cover and structure. Really, once we see grasses exceed 30%, deer use really begins to decline. So when we're doing this management, we're really focused on an herbaceous woody or herbaceous broadleaf forb cover. Those forbs that are 4 to 6 foot tall are going to be the ones that are providing our food and cover. Grasses don't provide a whole lot of value towards white-tailed deer. They're mainly there to carry the fire, to be honest. But there is some structure and cover, and of course, some of that thermal and shading that they do provide as well. But we really don't want to go beyond 30% grass. And another slide here, just to kind of reiterate the impact of a burned area. This is a study that was done by Marcus Lashley with at that time with the Mississippi State University. They just burned a 30-yard radius around tree stands and found that that produced 13 times more shot opportunities during the month of October. And how was that? Just by burning that small radius around a stand, provided some cover and some food that was otherwise lacking. So those deer really do seek out burned areas. And this is a really good study that kind of reiterated just the impact even burning on a small scale can provide. Further on, applying the research further. So even though deer do avoid freshly burned areas, there's still value in burning. We just don't want to burn large areas all at one time. Again, that patchwork approach is what you really want to be thinking about. So burning smaller blocks of land, for example, a 2 to 5 acre piece for every 35 acres is a good kind of rate to think about. You don't want to burn really large adjoining tracts. You kind of want to rotate those in a time period to where you can move your burning around your landscape and kind of consider what's your property lacking. If we burn at the dormant season in the more longer interval, at that 4 to 7 years, we're going to increase our cover, holding cover on the property, that really dense cover. Versus if we burn in the growing season at shorter interval, that 1 to 3 year return, we're really going to increase a lot more of our forb and browse production and fawning cover, for example. So we usually get the question of, okay, what's kind of the percentage or rate of land I should keep in X, Y, or Z? And it's such an it depends question. A lot of it depends on the composition of your landscape and surrounding landscapes as well. For example, if you're surrounded in row crop, like I just showed with the cornfields, you might manage a whole lot more for cover in the long term, for example. So your forest and your opening management could differ, but in general, we kind of recommend that forests produce or are maintained at about 60 to 75% of the land area. And these are producing both hard and soft mass, the acorn and berry and production, and then also some bedding areas as well. You can have pine dominated forests, you can have hardwood dominated forests, and you'll manage those differently based on, of course, rotation in a pine and rotation in hardwoods are going to be very different. But regardless, they do need disturbance. And when I talk about forested areas, I don't mean close canopy forest. You really need to maintain your forest with at least 30% open canopy to really provide wildlife value. That doesn't mean they're all going to be within 30% forest canopy at all the time. But throughout the land that you got under management, the more that you can maintain with at least 30% canopy, you're getting sunlight on the ground and you're getting that browse and that cover production. And here's a good visual to put with that. We have a closed canopy hardwood on the left there. You can see a 6-foot tall man standing about 200 yards away from where I took that picture. And there's not a whole lot being produced out there. Deer aren't going to spend a lot of time in here until the acorns are dropping. And the converse of that is to the picture there on the right, where you have a thinned hardwood stand, some burning that's occurred in there, and the cover at ground level is just night and day from a closed canopy stand versus one that has a canopy that's beyond 30% open canopy, allowing that sunlight to get to the ground and those shrubs and herbaceous cover to respond. And same thing is true here. Here's the picture of that same pine stand I showed you earlier with not a whole lot more than pine needles on the ground versus one that's been thinned. And in this case, seen a winter fire return interval of every 2 years. Again, that cover is just absolutely night and day based on the light hitting the ground and the fire that they're running through that stand. As far as openings are concerned, this is one that can vary a lot. It's anywhere between 5 to 25% of the land area, and really just 1 to 5% of a property should really be maintained in food plot plantings. And that's really because we can manage a whole lot more economically for browse and cover so much more than what we can with the expense that food plots are. So these can be places like pastures, hay fields, and fallowed fields. It's a good idea to not provide a broad spectrum broadleaf control if you're looking to try to marry livestock production with some value for wildlife. Very often, where we're applying, products such broadleaf control, like a very common one is grazon, we end up with solely pasture grasses and very little wildlife use. They just don't have a reason to be in those fields. So if we can maintain some of these fields a little bit dirtier and tolerate some broadleaves coming up in there and attract and provide some value for deer and turkey, the better off we're going to be. But we can often incorporate openings like power lines, logging roads, fire breaks around a property. If we daylight the roads, get some trees off the roads and allow some early pioneering species to come in on areas like that, that's a great way to incorporate into that this percentage of openings. Also consider the rotation, like I've talked about earlier on, and if you're going to have some fawning cover, it's a good idea to try to keep that in somewhat close proximity to other nutrition sources as well. A little bit of fawning cover in the middle of a big, wide open, closed canopy hardwoods isn't going to be the most beneficial, to where if you can kind of keep some of these more covered areas at that later burn rotation in that 3 to 5 year close to some 1 to 2 year returns, you're going to be able to have that mother move that fawn to some of the other browsing areas a lot easier than she would have to travel a long ways away. And then, of course, we have food plots and agricultural fields planted in a lot of the things that we would consider and usually do plant for both cool and warm season plots. It's best off to try to keep these in some of your more flat, productive areas, and then manage some of these other early successional type vegetation in some more maybe difficult to disc or access areas, to where you can just maintain those with fire and herbicide. Um, and we'll go through some of the browse availability based on some of these different vegetation components like we've just talked about. So in an unmanaged stand, again, going back to this picture of a closed canopy hardwoods, you'll have very, very little pounds of browse produced per year per acre. We're looking at anywhere between 25 to 100 in a closed canopy stand, whether it's in the wintertime like we see here, or whether it's in the summertime like you see here. Very little browse being produced. In food plots, we can produce a lot of browse and good quality nutrition, but it's at a really high cost, right? Food plots are high input. Seed and lime and fertilizer and the herbicide and gas and time that goes into these can be substantial. So you see food plots anywhere between this 2 to 10,000 pounds per acre, but they are at a very high cost. If we simply burn a closed canopy stand, very often we're not going to getting a whole lot of browse produced at that point. You do see more, 150 to anywhere to maybe even 500 pounds to the acre. However, and this goes into this picture as well. These are both shaded stands, just burned at different intervals. However, if we thin that stand, you can see a lot of sunlight coming in and producing forage anywhere between that 5 to 800 pounds to the acre. However, if we thin and then also burn the stand, you can really begin to increase your forage by reducing that litter layer and that coverage of leaf or pine needle litter. You can spur on the food bank quite a bit, and that goes whether it's pine stands or back to this hardwood stand, like I showed y'all earlier. And of course, early succession. And this is Dr. Harper with the University of Tennessee, where these numbers had come from his work and his students. Early succession between it can produce anywhere between 600 to 4,000 pounds to the acre, but at such a lower cost by simply going in and removing tree coverage or spraying out pasture grasses and burning. You can produce a lot of forage on the landscape at a really large scale at a fraction of the cost of, for example, food plots. And it's important to understand that not all openings and early succession is going to be created equal. A lot of it depends on the plant community is there, what you've got on site, also how it's managed. We want to try to maintain an open ground level to where these animals, turkey and deer and otherwise, can navigate and manage through some of that vegetation. Sometimes it can get so thick to where there's not a lot of value there. They just can't get in to use the stand. So it's also important to point out that really short perennial carpet grasses, like we see with our pasture and hay forages, those are going to lack the structural attributes and the forage value that our native plants do have. And this is a good visual for that as well. Here you can see my boot in a fescue field. Yes, there's some broom sedge there, a native warm season grass, but it's dominated in fescue. Virtually no value there as far as cover or browse is concerned. Just 13% crude protein and a fescue that deer don't eat is not a lot of value. Versus on the right hand side here, where we have our native warm season bunch grasses. We have black-eyed Susan popping up, ragweeds in there. Lots of other things are in this field, and it's at an open structure ground level to where animals can get in here, use it for cover and browse. Here's another example of the fescue old field that was walked away from. There are a lot of beneficial forbs and shrubs popping up in this old fescue field, but it's still dominated in the at the ground level in just a thick mat of fescue versus this mountainside pasture where the fescue was completely sprayed out of in November, burned off, and all of these native forbs responded. Without that fescue layer below, you have a lot of opportunity for small game deer and turkey to get in here, browse, bed, other animals to nest in. A really good example of needing to get off some of those cool season perennial grasses or warm season perennial grasses that were intended for livestock to really improve the overall value of an early successional area. So one thing I'll say is that beauty for some of these areas is going to be in the eye of the beholder. Your neighbors are going to look at you funny as far as having that, snaky, scrubby, nasty looking old field or early succession in your forest understory. But, as rabbits hop around it and turkeys strutting it and deer bed and run in and out of it, you can just kind of smile and nod and have a better hunting season than them. So as far as, further resources down the road for y'all interested in pursuing some of this management or asking some more questions, we have a staff here at Alabama Extension. You can find us at aces.edu. We have forestry and wildlife agents positioned throughout the state. Tennessee operates much in the same way, but more at the county level, and specialists throughout as well. You can visit their website and directory. We have resources on our webpage, publications. If you'd like to learn more about managing deer, this is more on collecting harvest data, conducting camera surveys, and also forming a hunting cooperative as well. And lots of good resources out there through Dr. Harper, specifically with the University of Tennessee. These food plot and early succession and forest stand publications that he has produced through his research are exceptional at transforming properties for wild game and management. Highly recommend you check those out too if you're interested in pursuing some of this vegetation. I've put together a video series, just putting a visual to a lot of the things that Dr. Harper and his students and others have learned and documented on how to renovate and establish some of this early succession and provide value in those old fields. Lots of good resources out there for prescribed burning. This is one that's put out through USDA. You can find that free online at that website there, or just type in the title and you'll find it on most search engines. We do have private land biologists with our Department of Conservation and Natural Resources here in Alabama. They're also positioned throughout the state. And we also have a deer management assistance program that can help you to improve your deer herds. And so does the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency. That website can be found there, where you can also find the area biologist and also Quail Forever biologists that would serve your area. So this is my contact information. I'm glad to answer questions, even beyond the state line of Alabama, even beyond the bordering counties of Marion and Franklin here in Jackson. I'm glad to help anyone interested in wildlife enhancement of all types. Feel free to reach out to me there. Often my cell phone or email is the best way to get a hold of me. So feel free to reach out if you'd like to pursue wildlife management any further. Thank you for attending today's presentation.